He had nothing left to lose, so he chose to save someone else instead. The rain came down in thin, relentless sheets, tapping against the rusted bus stop like fingers that refused to let go, and Daniel Hayes stood there with his shoulders hunched, a worn army jacket clinging to his frame, the fabric damp and heavy as if it carried every year he'd spent being forgotten. The city moved around him without seeing him, headlights smearing across wet asphalt, tires hissing, people rushing past with eyes fixed forward, careful not to meet his, because meeting his meant acknowledging something they didn't want to understand. 42 degrees, maybe colder with the wind, the kind that slipped through seams and settled into bone, and Daniel could feel it in his hands, stiff and slow, the knuckles cracked from too many nights like this. He had a place he could go, a temporary shelter 2 blocks down, a cot that might still be available if he got there before the line filled, but time had already stretched thin, and the sky promised worse before it got better. Then he heard it, not loud, not dramatic, just wrong, a soft, uneven sound beneath the rhythm of rain, like someone trying not to fall apart in public. Across the street, near a dimly lit crosswalk, a woman stood frozen at the curb, her coat too light for the weather, her breath visible in short, panic bursts, one hand pressed against her chest as if steadying something inside that refused to stay steady. Cars passed too fast, the light changed, people flowed around her like water around a stone, and no one stopped. Daniel watched for a second longer than most would, long enough to recognize that look, the quiet kind of distress that didn't shout for help but needed it all the same. He exhaled slowly, the decision settling in before the thought fully formed, and stepped off the curb into the rain, leaving behind the small, fragile chance of warmth waiting for him down the block. The cold hit harder out in the open, wind cutting sideways, soaking through his sleeves, but he kept moving, boots splashing through shallow puddles as he crossed toward her, the city noise dimming in his ears the way it used to before a mission, when everything narrowed to one point, one person, one moment that mattered. He said, voice steady despite the tremor in his hands, and she looked at him like she hadn't expected anyone to notice, her eyes wide, glassy, searching his face for something she couldn't name. For a second, neither of them spoke, rain running down between them, pooling at their feet, the world continuing on without pause, and then she whispered, barely audible, I can't breathe. Daniel nodded once, calm, controlled, the way he had learned years ago in places far from here, and stepped closer, guiding her gently away from the curb, away from the rush, into the narrow shelter of the bus stop where the wind softened just enough to matter. You're okay, he said quietly, not because he knew it for certain, but because sometimes that was where it started, and as she focused on his voice, on the rhythm of his words, something shifted, small and fragile but real, like a match struck in the dark. Minutes passed, maybe more, time bending around them, until her breathing slowed, her shoulders lowered, and the tightness in her expression eased just enough to let light back in. She looked at him again, really looked this time, taking in the worn jacket, the damp hair, the tired eyes that still held something steady beneath it all, and asked the question most people never did. Why would you help me? Daniel paused, rain tapping softly above them, and for a moment the answer felt heavier than it should, but he gave it anyway, simple, unadorned. Because someone should. And then, as quietly as he had come, he stepped back into the rain, turning away before she could say anything more, before names were exchanged, before the moment became something else, leaving behind only the echo of a choice no one else had seen, and the faint imprint of grace where it had briefly touched the world. The rain did not stop when Daniel Hayes walked away, it only softened, turning from a sharp insistence into a quiet persistence that clung to the edges of the city, and he felt it soak through his jacket as he moved down the block, each step heavier than the last, not from regret but from the weight of what he had chosen to give up without thinking. The shelter lights glowed faintly in the distance, a dull yellow promise flickering behind fogged windows, but when he reached the door, there were already too many bodies inside, too many voices laid in tired murmurs, and a volunteer at the entrance shook her head with an apology that carried no solution. We are full tonight. Daniel nodded once, as if he had expected nothing different, and stepped back into the cold without argument, because arguing did not create space where there was none. He found his usual place beneath the overhang of an old hardware store 2 blocks away, where the wind curled around the corners but did not cut straight through, and he lowered himself onto the concrete with a quiet exhale, pulling his jacket tighter, the damp fabric offering little warmth but enough to pretend. Across the street, a neon sign buzzed faintly, casting a pale blue glow that flickered like a heartbeat struggling to stay steady, and Daniel watched it for a while, letting the rhythm settle his thoughts the way distant artillery once had, something constant in a world that rarely was. He reached into his pocket and felt the small, familiar weight of his dog tags, the metal cool against his fingertips, edges worn smooth by years of carrying them long after the uniform was gone, and for a moment, he closed his eyes, not to sleep but to remember that he had once belonged somewhere, that there had been a time when his name meant something more than a passing glance people avoided. The night stretched on, slow and unkind, and sleep came in fragments, broken by the cold, by the sound of passing cars, by the occasional footsteps that paused just long enough to decide whether to keep walking, and always did. When morning finally arrived, it did not bring warmth, only a softer light that revealed the same streets, the same faces, the same quiet indifference, and Daniel stood with a stiffness in his joints that made every movement deliberate, as if his body needed to be convinced to keep going. He made his way toward a small diner on the corner of 5th and Maple, a place that sometimes allowed him to sit near the back if he kept to himself, and the bell above the door gave a soft chime as he entered, the scent of coffee and grease wrapping around him like a memory he could not quite hold on to. He took a seat at the far end, hands wrapped loosely around a chipped mug someone had left behind, letting the residual warmth seep into his fingers, and for a few minutes, the world felt quieter, manageable. The door opened again, and he did not look up at first, not until the shift in the room changed the air, subtle but unmistakable, the kind of presence that drew attention without asking for it. When he did glance up, his breath caught just slightly, not from recognition at first, but from the way she stood there, composed yet searching, her eyes moving across the room until they found him with a certainty that felt almost impossible. The woman from the night before stepped closer, her coat dry now, her posture steadier, but there was something in her expression that had not been there before, something softer, more intentional, and when she spoke, her voice carried none of the panic he had heard in the rain. "I was hoping I would find you." Daniel said nothing, his fingers tightening slightly around the mug, instinct pulling him toward distance even as something else held him in place. She reached into her bag and pulled out a small envelope, simple, unmarked, and placed it gently on the table between them, not pushing it toward him, not forcing anything, just offering. "My name is Margaret Whitmore," she said, the word settling into the space with quiet weight, "and I owe you more than I can explain." Daniel glanced at the envelope, then back at her, the distance between who they were laid bare in the simplest details, and after a moment, he shook his head once, slow and certain. "You do not owe me anything." Margaret studied him, as if trying to understand the shape of that answer, then nodded, not in agreement but in acceptance of something she could not change. "Maybe not," she said softly, "but I would like to try." The diner noise returned around them, plates clinking, voices rising and falling, but for a brief moment, it felt as if the world had narrowed again to just the two of them, balanced on the edge of a choice that neither of them fully understood, and Daniel, after a long pause, reached forward and picked up the envelope, not because he wanted what was inside, but because something in the way she had said his life mattered made it harder to walk away this time. Daniel did not open the envelope right away, he only turned it over in his hands, feeling the weight of it as if it carried more than paper, as if something inside it might shift the fragile balance he had built just to make it through each day, and for a long moment he simply sat there, the noise of the diner fading into a dull hum around him while Margaret Whitmore remained standing across the table, patient, composed, not pressing him, not asking for anything in return. Finally, he slid a finger beneath the flap and opened it with careful precision, the kind of movement that came from years of handling things that mattered more than they looked, and inside he found a small stack of bills and a card with a handwritten number, nothing extravagant, nothing overwhelming, just enough to be noticed, just enough to change a night or two. He glanced up at her, a flicker of something unreadable crossing his face, and shook his head again, quieter this time. "This is too much." Margaret did not argue, she only met his gaze with a steadiness that felt unfamiliar to him, the kind that did not come from obligation or pity, but from something closer to respect. "It is not enough," she replied gently, and there was no performance in her voice, no attempt to convince, only a simple truth offered without decoration. Daniel looked back down at the envelope, at the edges of the bills that could mean warmth, a meal, a few nights without the cold pressing in from every side, and for a moment his grip tightened as if he might close it again and hand it back, return to the certainty of having nothing instead of the uncertainty of accepting something. But then he remembered the way her breath had broken in the rain, the way her voice had searched for something steady and found it in him, and he exhaled slowly, the tension easing just enough to let the decision settle. "I will take what I need," he said, sliding part of the money back toward her across the table, "and the rest stays with you." Margaret watched the gesture, something like surprise softening her expression before it gave way to understanding, and she nodded once, accepting the boundary he had drawn without trying to redraw it herself. "Then we will call it even," she said, though they both seemed to know that it was not how things worked. Time moved forward again, the waitress passing by with a pot of coffee, the bell above the door chiming as new customers entered, and Daniel tucked the smaller portion of bills into his jacket pocket along with the card, the paper brushing against his dog tags as if linking two separate parts of his life without asking permission. Margaret stepped back then, adjusting her coat, her posture returning to the quiet composure she carried into the room, but before she turned to leave, she paused, her eyes lingering on him just long enough to leave an impression that would not fade easily. "If you ever need more than a night or two," she said, "call the number." Daniel gave a slight nod, not a promise, not a refusal, just an acknowledgement of the possibility, and she left the diner without looking back, the door closing softly behind her as the world resumed its ordinary pace. For a while, Daniel remained seated, his hands resting on the table, the warmth of the room seeping into him in a way that felt almost unfamiliar, and when he finally stood, there was a subtle shift in the way he moved, not lighter, not free, but steadier, as if something inside him had been acknowledged after a long time of being overlooked. That evening, he returned to the shelter earlier than before, the line shorter, the door still open, and for the first time in weeks, he found a place inside, a narrow cot beneath a dim overhead light, the thin blanket scratchy but real, the air warmer than the street, and as he lay there, staring up at the ceiling, he reached into his pocket and touched the card again, tracing the numbers with his thumb as if committing them to memory without meaning to. Days turned into weeks, and the money stretched further than he expected. Because he used it carefully, deliberately, as if honoring something unseen in the way it had been given, and though he never called the number, he did not throw it away either, keeping it folded neatly with his tags, a quiet reminder that for one moment in the rain, he had been seen, and that sometimes, even when nothing else changed, that alone was enough to carry a man a little further down the road. Winter settled in slowly, not with a single storm but with a quiet persistence that turned the edges of the city colder each morning, and Daniel Hayes began to notice the way his breath lingered longer in the air, the way his fingers took more time to respond, the way even the smallest tasks carried a weight that had not been there before, and yet he kept moving, because stopping had never been an option he trusted. The shelter became a temporary rhythm, a place where nights were measured by the soft creak of cots and the low murmur of men carrying stories they rarely spoke aloud, and Daniel remained mostly silent among them, not out of distance but out of habit, the kind built over years of learning that words did not always lead to understanding. During the day, he found small work where he could, helping unload deliveries behind a grocery store on Maple, sweeping the narrow alley beside a hardware shop, tasks paid in cash or sometimes just in food, but he accepted them the same way he accepted everything else, with quiet consistency, never asking for more than what was offered. The card stayed with him, folded carefully against the metal of his dog tags, and there were moments, usually in the early hours before sunrise, when he would take it out and study the numbers again, not because he intended to call, but because it reminded him that somewhere beyond the narrow stretch of streets he occupied, there existed a different kind of life, one that had briefly intersected with his and left something behind. Weeks turned into months, and the city shifted with the season, storefronts decorating for holidays, lights strung across windows, music drifting out onto sidewalks in soft, familiar melodies that spoke of warmth and gatherings Daniel no longer expected to be part of, and yet there were small changes he could not ignore, subtle but real, like the way the diner owner began to leave a fresh cup of coffee at the end of the counter without being asked, or the way the volunteer at the shelter greeted him by name instead of a nod, or the way he found himself standing a little straighter when he walked, as if the memory of being seen had quietly reshaped something inside him. One evening, as the sky dimmed early under a blanket of grey clouds, Daniel finished a short shift stacking boxes behind the grocery store and stepped out into the cold, his hand sore but steady, and as he reached into his pocket to adjust his jacket, his fingers brushed against the card again, the edges worn now from time, the ink slightly faded but still clear enough to read. He paused there on the sidewalk, the noise of the city moving around him, cars passing, voices blending into a distant hum, and for the first time since he had received it, the thought of calling did not feel like an intrusion, but like a question he had been avoiding without knowing why. He turned the card over once, then again, as if the answer might be hidden on the other side, but it remained what it had always been: simple, direct, waiting. Across the street, a family walked past, a child laughing as he tugged at his father's sleeve, their silhouettes framed by the warm glow of a shop window, and Daniel watched them for a moment longer than necessary, not with longing exactly, but with a quiet recognition of something he had once known and had not entirely lost. He exhaled slowly, the breath visible in the cold air, and slipped the card back into his pocket, not out of rejection, but out of a decision that had taken shape without words, and instead of turning toward the payphone at the corner, he continued down the street toward the shelter, his steps measured, deliberate, carrying him forward in the only way he understood. That night, as he lay on the narrow cot, the ceiling above him dim and still, he closed his eyes and let the sounds of the room settle around him, and for the first time in a long while, sleep came without interruption, deep and steady. As if something within him had found a place to rest, even if only for a little while, and outside, beyond the walls, the city continued its quiet motion, unaware that somewhere within it, a man who had once been invisible was slowly, almost imperceptibly, finding his way back to himself. Time does not announce when it begins to change a man, it moves quietly, almost respectfully, and Daniel Hayes did not notice the exact moment when the street stopped feeling like a place he was trapped in and became something he was simply passing through, but the shift was there, subtle and steady, like the first hint of warmth before sunrise. By early spring, the air had softened, carrying the scent of damp pavement and budding trees, and Daniel found himself waking before the others at the shelter, not out of restlessness, but out of purpose, a quiet pull to move before the day crowded in. He began helping more at the shelter without being asked, stacking supplies, fixing loose hinges on doors that had been left unattended for too long, small repairs that did not change the building but made it feel less forgotten, and the staff noticed, not with grand gestures, but with the kind of acknowledgement that came in simple words: "We appreciate you," spoken without ceremony but carrying more weight than it seemed. The diner on 5th and Maple became more than a place to warm his hands, it became a place where he was expected, where the same chipped mug waited for him each morning, filled before he even sat down, and the owner, a quiet man named Carl, would nod once from behind the counter, a silent agreement that no explanation was needed between them. The card remained in Daniel's pocket, its edges softened further by time, the ink slightly blurred but still legible, and though he had not called the number, he had stopped thinking of it as something separate from his life. It had become part of it, like the dog tags he still carried, a reminder of where he had been and what had shaped him. One afternoon, while helping unload crates behind the grocery store, Daniel felt a sudden stiffness in his hand, a brief hesitation that lingered longer than it should, and he paused, flexing his fingers as if to remind them of their purpose, but the sensation passed as quickly as it came, leaving behind only a quiet awareness that time moved forward whether a man was ready or not. Later that day, as the sun dipped low and stretched long shadows across the sidewalk, Daniel walked past a small construction site where a crew was packing up tools, their voices carrying a tired but satisfied tone, and one of the foremen, a broad man with a weathered face, watched Daniel for a moment before calling out, "You ever done any real work?" The question was not unkind, but it carried an edge of testing, and Daniel stopped, turning slightly, his posture instinctively straightening in a way that had not faded with time. "Yes," he replied simply. The man studied him for a second longer, then jerked his head toward a stack of lumber. "Show up here tomorrow at 7. If you can keep up, you can stay." There was no promise beyond that, no guarantee, but it was enough, more than enough, and Daniel gave a single nod, the kind that sealed agreements without needing words. That night, as he lay on his cot, the sounds of the shelter settling into their usual rhythm, he reached into his pocket and pulled out the card again, holding it between his fingers, the paper worn but steady, and for a moment, he considered what it might mean to call, not out of need, but out of something else, something closer to acknowledgement, but instead he placed it back carefully, the decision not to call feeling less like avoidance and more like trust, as if the path he was on did not require him to look back just yet. Morning came early, the sky pale and clear, and Daniel arrived at the construction site before the others, the air crisp but no longer biting, and when the foreman saw him standing there, ready, he gave a brief nod of approval before handing him a pair of gloves, worn but functional, and pointed toward the work that needed to be done. The hours passed in steady motion, lifting, carrying, building, the kind of work that demanded presence and rewarded effort, and Daniel moved through it with a quiet focus that came from years of discipline, each task completed without complaint. Without hesitation, and by the end of the day, when the tools were set down and the crew began to disperse, the foreman approached him again, his expression unreadable for a moment before it softened just enough. "Be here tomorrow," he said, and this time, it sounded less like a test and more like an expectation. Daniel nodded once, the weight of the day settling into his muscles in a way that felt earned, and as he walked back toward the shelter, the city around him seemed different, not because it had changed, but because he had, and somewhere in his pocket, the card rested quietly against the metal of his tags, waiting, not as an escape, but as a reminder that sometimes, the smallest moment of kindness did not just save a life. It gave it time to find its way back. Summer arrived without asking permission, the air turning thick and warm, carrying the scent of cut lumber and sun-baked asphalt, and Daniel Hayes moved through it with a steady rhythm that no longer felt borrowed but earned, his days beginning before the sun cleared the rooftops and ending with the slow ache of muscles that reminded him he had built something real, even if no one else stopped to notice. The construction site had become more than work, it had become a place where time was measured in progress, in beams raised and foundations set, in the quiet satisfaction of seeing something take shape where there had once been nothing, and Daniel found himself settling into that rhythm with a kind of focus that left little room for the past to pull at him. The foreman, whose name he learned was Rick, spoke little but watched closely, his approval given in nods rather than words, and over weeks that turned into months, those nods came more often, until one morning Rick handed Daniel a new pair of gloves and said, "You are staying on," as if it had already been decided long before the words were spoken. The shelter became less of a necessity and more of a place he was preparing to leave, his small savings growing slowly, carefully set aside in an envelope he kept hidden beneath his cot, each dollar representing not just money, but distance from the life he had been trying to outwalk. At the diner, Carl began leaving more than coffee, sometimes a plate of eggs or toast appearing without request, and Daniel accepted it with the same quiet gratitude he gave everything else, never asking why, never needing to, because the answer was already understood. The card remained in his pocket, worn nearly soft at the edges now, the ink still visible but faded enough to feel like something from another time, and though he had not called the number, he carried it with the same care as his dog tags, 2 pieces of metal and paper that held more weight than they should. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in muted shades of orange and grey, Daniel finished a long day of work and sat alone on the edge of the construction site, his boots resting on a stack of timber, his hands still, for once, as if they had nothing left to prove. The city stretched out in front of him, quieter at this hour, the noise softened, the movement slower, and he let himself sit there longer than usual, not thinking, not planning, just existing in a moment that did not demand anything from him. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the card again, turning it between his fingers, the paper catching the last light of the day, and for the first time, the thought of calling did not feel like stepping backward or reaching for help, but like closing a circle that had been left open. He traced the numbers once more, committing them to memory in a way he had avoided before, and just as he slipped it back into his pocket, his phone, a simple prepaid device he had bought weeks earlier with careful budgeting, buzzed faintly in his hand, the sound unfamiliar enough to catch him off guard. He frowned slightly, pulling it out and looking at the screen, where an unknown number flashed, steady and insistent, and for a moment he hesitated, not out of fear, but out of the quiet understanding that some calls changed more than just a day. The buzzing continued, a soft vibration against his palm, and finally, he answered, lifting it to his ear with a calm that came from years of facing the unknown without flinching. Daniel Hayes. The voice on the other end was measured, professional, carrying a tone that did not belong to the streets or the job site, but to something more structured, more distant. "Yes," he replied, his voice even. There was a brief pause, the kind that carried weight, before the voice continued. "My name is Thomas Green. I am calling from Whitmore and Associates. I have been trying to reach you for some time." Daniel's gaze drifted out over the horizon, the last light fading, the city settling into evening, and something in the name stirred a memory he had not touched in months, a moment in the rain, a voice that had once asked for breath. He said nothing, only listened, as the man continued. "This concerns the estate of Margaret Whitmore." The words landed quietly, without force, but they carried a gravity that shifted the air around him, and Daniel felt his grip tighten slightly on the phone, his other hand instinctively moving to his pocket, where the worn card rested against the metal of his tags, as if the past had reached forward, not to pull him back, but to bring something with it. The voice spoke again, steady, precise. "There are matters that require your attention. I would like to arrange a meeting." Daniel remained silent for a moment longer, the sounds of the city returning around him, distant, unchanged, and then he nodded once, though no one could see it. "All right," he said quietly, and in that single word, something shifted again, not sudden, not overwhelming, but certain, like the first step onto a path that had been waiting for him all along. The meeting was set for 9 in the morning, downtown, in a building Daniel Hayes had walked past 100 times without ever imagining he would step inside, and when the day arrived, he stood across the street for a moment longer than necessary, looking up at the glass and steel that reflected a version of the city he had never belonged to, the early light catching in sharp lines that felt almost too clean to be real. He wore the same clothes he had carefully set aside the night before, the least worn shirt he owned, boots cleaned as best he could manage, his jacket still old but brushed free of dust, and though nothing about him matched the polished world waiting beyond. Those doors, there was something in the way he stood, steady and composed, that did not ask for permission to enter. Inside, the air felt different, cooler, quieter, the noise of the street replaced by soft footsteps and muted voices, and a receptionist greeted him with a professional calm that did not linger on his appearance, only asked for his name and directed him toward a waiting area where the chairs were too comfortable to feel real. Daniel sat, his hands resting loosely in his lap, his gaze taking in the space without attachment, noticing details the way he always had, the arrangement of furniture, the rhythm of movement, the way people carried themselves when they believed they were in control. A few minutes later, a man approached, tall, composed, his suit precise in a way that suggested routine rather than effort, and he extended a hand. "Mr. Hayes, I am Thomas Green." Daniel stood and shook it, his grip firm, his expression neutral, and followed the man down a quiet hallway into an office that overlooked the city, the view stretching far beyond anything Daniel had allowed himself to consider. They sat across from each other, a polished desk between them, and for a moment, neither spoke, the silence holding a weight that did not feel uncomfortable, only significant. Thomas opened a folder, his movements deliberate, and looked up with a measured expression. "I appreciate you coming," he said, and Daniel gave a slight nod, waiting. The man continued, his tone steady, professional, but not without a trace of something softer beneath it. "Margaret Whitmore passed away 3 months ago." The words landed quietly, without drama, but Daniel felt them settle deeper than expected, a memory rising unbidden, rain against pavement, a voice searching for breath, and he remained still, absorbing it without interruption. Thomas watched him for a moment, then went on. "Before her passing, she left specific instructions regarding her estate, and your name was included." Daniel's brow tightened slightly, not in confusion, but in careful attention, and he leaned forward just enough to show he was listening without pressing for more. The folder was turned toward him. Documents neatly arranged, lines of text that spoke in language designed to define ownership and intention, and Thomas gestured lightly. "Ms. Whitmore owns several properties, but there is one in particular she wished to be transferred to you." Daniel's eyes moved across the page, the words forming slowly into something that did not immediately make sense: acres, boundaries, legal descriptions that stretched far beyond the streets he knew, and then a name, simple, unadorned, followed by a location that sat miles outside the city, where land opened instead of closed in. "It is a farm," Thomas said, his voice quieter now, as if acknowledging the weight of what he was saying. 120 acres, fully titled, with no outstanding debts. Daniel did not react right away, not because he did not understand, but because understanding took time when something arrived that did not fit the shape of your life, and he sat there, his hands still, his breathing steady, letting the words settle into something real. "Why?" he asked finally, the single word carrying more than it seemed, and Thomas exhaled softly, as if he had expected the question. He reached into the folder and pulled out a sealed letter, the paper aged slightly, the handwriting on the front unmistakably personal, and he placed it gently on the desk between them. "She anticipated that question," he said, "and she left this for you." Daniel looked at the letter, at the familiar curving that felt suddenly closer than the room around him, and for a moment, the city beyond the window faded, the office, the man across from him, all of it falling away until there was only that piece of paper and the memory of a night in the rain when two lives had crossed without expectation. He reached forward slowly, his fingers brushing against the envelope, and as he lifted it, something shifted again, not in the world around him, but within it, like a door opening quietly in a place he had not known was still there. Daniel held the letter for a long moment before opening it, his fingers resting along the edge as if the paper itself carried a pulse, something faint but steady, and when he finally broke the seal. He did it carefully, not out of hesitation, but out of respect for a voice he had only heard once and yet somehow recognized. The paper inside was simple, unadorned, the handwriting steady but personal, each line shaped by intention rather than formality, and as his eyes moved across the first words, the room around him seemed to quiet in a way that had nothing to do with sound. "If you are reading this," it began, "then I no longer have the chance to say this to you in person, and that is something I regret more than I can explain." Daniel exhaled slowly, the breath leaving him without force, and continued. "You may not remember me as anything more than a stranger on a cold night, but I remember you as the reason I was given another morning." His grip on the paper tightened slightly, not enough to crease it, just enough to anchor himself as the words unfolded. "That night, you did not ask who I was, you did not measure whether I deserved your help, you simply chose to stay when everyone else kept walking, and in that moment, you gave me something I had forgotten how to recognize, not just safety, but dignity." Daniel's gaze paused there, the words settling deeper than the others, and for a second, he looked away, out toward the window where the city stretched in quiet indifference, before returning to the page. "I searched for you afterward," the letter continued, "not to repay you, because I learned quickly that some things cannot be repaid, but to thank you in a way that matched what you gave me, and when I could not find you, I realized something that stayed with me long after. You did not help me to be remembered. You helped me because it was who you are." Daniel swallowed once, the motion subtle but real, and the office around him felt smaller now, more contained, as if the space had shifted to make room for something unseen. "The farm I am leaving to you is not just land," the letter went on, "it is the only place I ever felt free from expectations, from the weight of a world that measures worth in ways that do not always make sense, and I have come to believe that it belongs to someone who understands that freedom is not something you take, but something you give." His eyes moved more slowly now, each line carrying a weight that did not rush. "If you choose to accept it, then I hope it becomes whatever you need it to be, not what anyone else expects. And if you choose to walk away, then know that the gift was never the land. It was the moment you chose to see me when I could not see myself." Daniel lowered the letter slightly, his hand steady but his expression changed in a way that was almost imperceptible, something softer settling into the lines of his face, not relief, not disbelief, but recognition, as if something he had carried without knowing it had finally been given a name. Thomas Green remained silent across the desk, allowing the moment to exist without interruption, and after a while, Daniel folded the letter carefully, aligning the edges as precisely as he had opened them, and held it for a second longer before placing it back on the desk. "There are documents to sign," Thomas said gently, not breaking the quiet, only guiding it forward, and Daniel nodded once, the motion calm, deliberate, as if the decision had already been made somewhere deeper than words. He signed where he was shown, each stroke of the pen simple but final, and when it was done, Thomas closed the folder with a soft, definitive sound. "The property is now yours," he said, and Daniel sat back slightly, the words settling into place not as a shock, but as a continuation of something that had begun long before either of them had recognized it. Later, as he stepped out of the building and into the open air, the city felt different again, not because it had changed, but because it no longer defined the edges of what was possible, and Daniel reached into his pocket, pulling out the worn card one last time. The ink faded, the edges softened, and he looked at it for a moment before folding it alongside the letter, placing both carefully with his dog tags. 3 small pieces of his life now bound together, not as reminders of what had been lost, but as proof that even the quietest act, given freely and without witness, could travel further than any man ever intended, and return in ways no one could have predicted. The road to the farm stretched longer than Daniel Hayes expected, not in distance alone but in the quiet way it pulled him away from everything he had known, the city slowly dissolving behind him as concrete gave way to open land, the air shifting from the scent of exhaust and steel to something softer, something alive, like earth and wind and time moving at a different pace. The truck he borrowed from Rick rattled gently over the gravel road, the tires kicking up a faint trail of dust that lingered behind him like a memory reluctant to fade, and Daniel kept his hand steady on the wheel, his eyes forward, not searching, not questioning, just moving toward something he had already chosen. When the gate finally came into view, simple, weathered, standing without pretense, he slowed the truck and stepped out, the silence around him immediate and complete, broken only by the faint rustle of leaves and the distant call of something unseen. He pushed the gate open with a measured motion, the hinges creaking softly as if acknowledging his arrival, and drove through, closing it behind him out of habit more than necessity, a small act of respect for a place that felt untouched by the noise he had left behind. The land stretched wide, far beyond what he could take in at once, rolling fields edged by old fencing, a farmhouse set back near a cluster of trees, its paint faded but its structure steady, like it had been waiting without expectation. Daniel stepped out again when he reached the house, his boots pressing into the dry ground, the sun warm against his shoulders, and for a moment, he simply stood there, letting the stillness settle into him, not empty, not lonely, but full in a way that did not need to be explained. He walked up to the porch, the wooden boards creaking under his weight, and pushed the door open slowly, the interior carrying the faint scent of aged wood and something softer, something lived in, as if the walls still held echoes of quiet mornings and long evenings that had not been rushed. Dust lingered in the light that filtered through the windows, but nothing felt abandoned, only paused, like a breath held between moments. Daniel moved through the rooms without hurry, his hand brushing lightly against surfaces, not claiming, not changing, just acknowledging, until he reached a small table near the back window where another envelope rested, placed with intention, his name written in the same familiar hand. He picked it up, the motion steady, and opened it without hesitation this time, the words inside shorter but no less clear. If you made it here, then you understand something most people never do, that a life can change direction in a single moment, and that direction matters more than distance. This place was never meant to be kept, it was meant to be shared. Do with it what feels true, not what feels expected. Daniel folded the letter carefully and set it back down, his gaze drifting out the window where the land stretched open under the wide sky, and for the first time in a long while, he did not feel like he was passing through something temporary, he felt like he had arrived somewhere that did not require him to prove anything to stay. Days turned into weeks, and the farm began to change, not all at once, not in grand gestures, but in small, deliberate ways, repairs made to the fence, the porch reinforced, the fields cleared just enough to breathe again, and Daniel worked with the same quiet focus he had carried through everything else, not rushing, not forcing, just building something steady from what was already there. Word spread slowly, not through announcements, but through quiet connections, a man from the shelter who needed a place to rest, a veteran who had nowhere else to go, a stray dog that wandered onto the property and stayed, each arrival met without questions, without conditions, only with the same simple understanding that had guided Daniel from the beginning. One morning, as the sun rose over the fields, casting long shadows that softened as the light grew stronger, Daniel stood near the edge of the property, a German shepherd sitting beside him, its posture calm, its presence steady, and he rested a hand lightly on its back, the warmth grounding, familiar in a way that did not need explanation. The wind moved gently through the grass, the sound quiet and constant. And Daniel looked out across the land, not measuring what it was worth, not thinking about what it had been, only seeing what it had become, a place where something small had been allowed to grow into something lasting. He reached into his pocket, feeling the outline of the letter, the card, the dog tags, all of it still there, not as weight, but as foundation, and he let his hand rest there for a moment before lowering it again, his gaze steady, his breath even, and in the silence that followed, there was no need for words, because some stories do not end in victory or loss, they end in something quieter, something that does not demand attention, only recognition, the kind that lingers long after the moment has passed, like grace finding its way home.